my pleasure to be back at Rudin. I had the honor to speak here a few years ago at the request of Dean Filippov, and it's always a pleasure to be back here. It's especially interesting for me now because this university is one of the 5100 institutions, and I have the honor to be a member of the 5100 committee. So we will be looking closely at what you're doing in the coming period of time. So what I would like to do briefly this morning is to talk about two things. One of them is the global trends in higher education. None of these trends will be very surprising to any of you, since we all live in these challenging higher education times. But frequently, I think, those of us who are swimming in the ocean don't exactly understand what the ocean really is because we're too busy swimming. So I want to give you some kind of chance to think about what's going on more broadly, because I think it affects this university, all universities, because we are all part of a rapidly changing context. Indeed, in the past half century, part of a real academic revolution that's occurred in the world. And I want to move from that to talk about world-class universities, because the idea of 5100 and the goal of this university, regardless of 5100, is to be a world-class institution. Most universities in the world are not world-class. They are fine universities. So I'm going to try to define world-class and then give you a sense of some of the elements of that. And I want to conclude, I hope I have time for this, all this, with some questions for you. Yes, we can have a Q&A like everybody does, but I have a question which I would like you to focus on, because I think this university, more than almost anywhere else in the world, was founded with the international idea as part of its DNA, as part of its original concept. So now, in the 21st century, what does internationalization mean to you, to this institution? And how is this university going to capitalize, going to use its distinguished international tradition to move forward? Because from my very limited knowledge of this place, from my one visit before and a few conversations, your international networks, your graduates, your concept of student recruitment is all much more international than maybe any other Russian university, and I think more than almost all universities globally. So you have something that's very valuable here, which I'm not sure you entirely realize. So I'd like to, after I talk, come back and ask you to focus on how you can use your international reputation and image to your best advantage. So let me start with the academic revolution. There are two fundamental aspects of that revolution which affect us all around the world. And they are I think, somewhat contradictory. The first one is massification, because again, in the past half century, in some parts of the world, in the last 20 years, in a few other parts of the world, such as North America, in the last 1 century, higher education has expanded dramatically so that it reaches a much larger percentage of the population than it once did. Higher education, as we all know, and in the lifetimes, at least of some of us in this room, not all, higher education was a preserve of the elite. In most countries, 3, 5, 9% of the relevant age group was going on to higher education. Only in a few countries was that percentage 25 or 30%. Now it's quite common for countries to have an enrollment rate of 60% or more. And Russia, in fact, is a leading country in terms of its coverage of the youth population going on to post-secondary education. So we've seen massification, and that's truly revolutionary in the whole global history of universities of higher education since their beginning, more or less 800 or 900 years ago. In 2012, 200 million students were studying in higher education around the world, and that's double what it was just a little more than a decade earlier. And the number continues to grow even now. In the coming 30 years, more than half global growth in enrollments will be in just 2 countries, China and India. And of course, that has implications especially for them, but it also has implications for the rest of us in terms of recruiting international students, understanding the nature of global mobility, and so on. Massification has also had many other implications to it. It's meant that academic institutions have become more diverse in function, in student population, in educational background of students, in racial and ethnic diversity of different kinds. Countries have been forced, some successfully and some less so, to develop diversified systems of higher education, hopefully that articulate, that fit together. And I think in this respect, Russia is not a particularly successful example of developing such kind of a clear and rational system, but it must happen in these mass higher education environments. Diversification has meant that academic institutions have different and often new missions. They're not all universities anymore, and they're not all research focused anymore. They are doing a variety of things. We've seen also the growth of the private sector in higher education. And the private sector is now the fastest growing part of global higher education. And we've seen entire continents shift from major public university higher education systems to the majority of students going to private universities. Latin America, in this respect, is the most dramatic example, where now in all Latin American countries, with the exception of Cuba, and it's probably coming there, the majority of students now attend private higher education. I could go on at great length about the problems of private higher education. There are many, but it is a reality. The contradictory aspect of the global higher education revolution is what I've called, what many have called, the global knowledge economy. And that operates exactly in the opposite direction of massification, because as massification pushes diversity and pushes new missions and more democratic access, the global knowledge economy is pushing the world and particular countries toward research universities, toward elite higher education, toward academic institutions that can produce knowledge and knowledge products, and that's a very important distinction and point, related but somewhat different, at the very highest international levels. So the global knowledge economy has also stressed very strongly internationalization, because knowledge is a global product, increasingly so. And institutions which are going to be at the top of any national system or doing very well in the rankings, if you want to measure them by the rankings, are going to be internationally focused institutions. It is, of course, very significant that I am standing here in this distinguished university, speaking to you in English this morning, in a Russian context, with French colleagues sitting here, no doubt very angry that it's going on in English. And I hope everyone is understanding. In Russia, 10 years ago, 20 years ago anyway, this would be completely impossible. I lecture a lot around the world, and I have seen in my rather long experience in this business the change in linguistic, I wouldn't say preferences, but linguistic necessities that work to the advantage of imperial English, if you want to put it that way, as the language of sort of global knowledge transfer and increasingly publication. And you, of course, have to cope with that reality, often not so easy, but very much part of the development of globalization, and especially of the global knowledge economy, because increasingly science is functioning in English. What will that mean in the Russian context in terms of offering degree programs in English, encouraging or forcing your faculty members to publish in English journals, and many other implications? And I think these are not simple questions that can be answered by, yes, we have to succumb, we have to function mainly in English. They are careful, serious questions that need to be debated within particular countries, not just Russia, but even other very large countries like China, because they too are moving toward offering more programs in English. And in the Chinese case, maybe here in Russia also, programs in English aimed mainly at local students, at at a Chinese domestic market, but in English, so that they can function globally. And at the same time, we Americans and our friends in the UK and Australia, Canada to a lesser extent, do nothing about learning other people's languages. So that's not good for us. Point is, English is a challenge, and it's part of this global knowledge economy. But so are many other things. Knowledge products, patents and licenses of different kinds, multinational publishing and IT companies, and so on and so forth. So the global knowledge economy is pushing a small segment of this system. Let me move, for the rest of the time I have, to that small segment. And that small segment are the research universities. Defining them is not rocket science. It's fairly simple. Most people's definitions, in my view, are too narrow, but they are what is widely accepted. That's what the 5100 committee and the ministry here is pushing. And who is it for us to ask questions about such things? And what they're pushing are basically research-led universities. Universities that focus largely on research, that are measured by the productivity in research, not just in the publication of articles, but also with patents and knowledge products and other complicated aspects. But the world-class idea does not concern innovative teaching, really. It does not concern service to the community. It does not concern many important things which I think we would all agree are important parts of what a university should be doing. And I think that's unfortunate, but it's true. The research university sector is a small but very important one in every country. Take the United States. There are about 4,000 post-secondary institutions in the US. Maybe 200 of them, maybe, are research universities. The ones that are members of the Association of American Universities, which is the club of the elite institutions, and a small number of other ones, like my own university, which is not an AAU member, but is highly ranked. We're not AAU because we don't have engineering and we don't have medicine. But otherwise, we are a traditional research university. But 200 institutions out of 4,000 is not very many. And we need to keep that in mind. And I don't think that's a problem. I think that's probably about right for a complex system that in a mass higher education environment. The rest of the universities in America and in most other countries do, we hope, a good job of teaching, professional preparation, the other things, community service, the other things that universities should be doing. So world class implies the small proportion of universities that do research. Those universities produce most of the research, especially cutting-edge research. In America, about 90% of the money from the federal government that goes for scientific research goes to these 200 institutions. They produce the very large percentage of PhDs in the country, and so on. And you'll find statistics of that sort all around the world. In the Chinese case, The government, as many of you know, over the last 25 years has supported about 100 research universities through their 211 and 985 excellence programs. And those institutions have received many billions of equivalent US dollars to build up their research profiles with significant success. But those institutions, again, are a very small part of the total Chinese academic system. In the Chinese case, and to some extent in our own case in the US, the problem is that the rest of the system has been a little bit ignored. That is, the quality at the bottom, in China definitely, in America maybe, has actually somewhat deteriorated because so much attention is paid to the top of the system. So we have to think, in Russia, in other countries, we have to think about a system, a differentiated system and how it works. And you, at this institution, are at the top of the system. Good for you. You're doing important work. But never forget that you're part of a national system, and that's important. So research universities produce the research. They educate the brightest students. If you look in the Russian case at which universities are attracting the students with the highest unified state exam scores, they're the research universities, probably without any exception. And if you look in the context of, in China, the Gaokao score, which is their equivalent to a unified state exam, or in America with to the SAT or ACE, ACT tests, same story. So these universities employ the top professors, and they are the most internationalized institutions in terms of attracting international students, in terms of sending the largest numbers of their own students abroad for some kind of joint programs, study abroad opportunities, and so on. So let me spend a few minutes in conclusion with some of the elements that make, in my view, for a successful world-class research university. And you can see how this institution measures to these elements. And in fact, I'd be interested in some of your comments about that. There are, I think, a golden trinity of three key things. All the rest, and I'll discuss some in a few minutes, are part of this trinity. One is a concentration of talent, smart people, well-trained professors, bright, motivated students. Let us never forget that's the core, really is. Second, abundant resources. You cannot have a world-class university cheap. That's one of the reasons that 5100 exists, and why the Russian government is putting some money, I think, for the first time in a serious way, into these top institutions, and why other countries are doing the same thing. I might point out, kind of as a joke, but it's a true story, that in America, we are currently engaged in an unexcellence initiative. Why do I say that? Because our public research universities, the Berkeleys and the Virginias and the Illinois and the Wisconsins, such places, many of you probably have studied at those places, are being starved of state resources. And by state, I mean the 50 states, not the national government. The University of Virginia, for example, now gets about 8% of its total operating budget every year from the state of Virginia. The rest comes from student fees, philanthropy, selling products, knowledge products, t-shirts, football, sweaters, and other things. For us, for our system, that, I believe, is a long-term problem. And if we don't fix it pretty soon, we are going to start going down in the rankings, no question. Our private universities, great private universities, the Stanfords, the Harvards, the MITs, the Boston colleges, are doing fine because they don't rely on government funding. But the point is, abundant resources, no matter where they come from, are necessary. And the third part of the Trinity, I think, is favorable governance. That is, you have to have an internal structure from the rector on down, which is effective, which is committed, which is going to be able to provide the kind of excellent, innovative leadership that a world-class university needs. And sometimes that's the most difficult part of the whole equation, because countries, institutions have different traditions of governance. Some of them, in my opinion, as in some European countries, have too much democracy. Everything is in the hands of the faculty. Some, like in Latin America, have way too much democracy, where things are in the hands of the faculty and the students. I love students, and they should have a role in the university, but they shouldn't necessarily be voting on who's going to be the rector. We can have a long discussion about that, and I certainly would not presume to tell you how to organize an effective Russian university, given the traditions that are here. Let me, by the way, just mention one tradition, which I think in Russia and in China and in a few other countries is a serious problem. And that is the tradition of separating research institutes from universities. In Russia, as you know much better than I, the academy system is deeply entrenched in the society and in historical tradition and in reality. Most people agree that the best teaching and the best research go on in institutions that do both of those things in an integrated way. So Russia, in my opinion, is going to need to solve the academy problem somehow. Don't ask me how. If it's to really achieve top status. And somehow the academies have to be brought in, I believe, into the context of the higher education system. The Chinese are trying to deal with this in a way which I believe is a mistake. And that is, recently, the main Chinese Academy of Science has developed as part of itself a university. So the academy itself is now giving significant numbers of mainly PhD, some master's degrees, no undergraduate programs, as part of their work, as a way, I think, of keeping the universities out of their business. And I think in the long run, that's not a good answer to this issue. But they're trying, and we'll see what happens. let me mention just a couple more brief things. I talked about talent, professors and students. Talent means recruiting people on the basis of merit. This is not a particular Russian problem, at least not now. Not just letting people in because they know somebody or pay somebody off, but do well on exam scores and maybe have other attributes, because again, countries that rely only on a single exam for entry are missing out on some really smart kids. And many countries agree with that. In China, the traditional way to entering higher education is through the national exam, the Gaokao, which has been around since the time of Confucius. It works pretty well. But of course, it only measures one part of knowledge. And some of the best Chinese universities are now trying to do what the Americans have done for a long time, and that is try to figure out other ways of measuring talent, not to take the place of the Gaokao, but in addition to it. So, other countries, I think of Argentina, let into the university, any student who has graduated from high school. He or she can go to more or less any university they want. And the idea in Argentina is after one semester, they give these kids really hard courses, and they get rid of 60% of them. Not fair to the student, not very profitable to the society, but it is one way of weeding out people who are not able to continue with their studies. So talent is measured in different ways, and I don't know enough about the Russian context to know whether you are measuring your talent as effectively as you can, but you need to do so. I did talk a little bit about resources. I might point out simply that if you look around the world, there are only 2 countries that I know of, and another very few number of examples, 2 countries that have private research universities. And those 2 countries are the United States and Japan, both of which have old private universities that have a lot of resources and a lot of prestige and are truly part of the research university environment. And you can point out, probably on the fingers of 2 hands, a few other ones elsewhere in the world. The Catholic University in Chile, for example, Bilkent University in Turkey, and a few others. But most research universities are public. And as the state, as is happening in this country, as is happening in America, I think it will happen in China with the economic downturn there. As the state withdraws funding from the public research university sector, those institutions will be weakened. And that will be a problem if it isn't already. And let me absolutely conclude with just a few comments on internationalization. I mentioned before the problem of the English language. One has to deal with it in some constructive way, and that will differ according to institution, according to country, according to particular need. There is no one answer to that question, but it's there. It's an issue for the 21st century. And in my view, Chinese is not coming along to take the place of English. It's going to be English for quite a long time into the future. What other aspects of internationalization should a university go for? Some institutions are involved with branch campuses. By the way, if you look around the world, mostly to make money. No other reason. Some universities are involved deeply, as I know this university is, in joint degree programs. I tend to think that's a very constructive way of having what scholars call deep internationalization, if those programs work well. Other universities and countries, and the United States is one here, that at the top institutions do a pretty good job of making sure that their students have an internationalization experience by studying abroad, not for their whole degree, but for part of their degree, their home degree study. And again, because the market is so big in America, this institution probably, and others in Russia, although in America, Russia is a little bit of a hard sell these days, probably could do a more effective job in luring some part of that very large domestic U.S. market to study in Russia. In some countries, MOOCs and other distance education initiatives are part of internationalization. Universities use foreign MOOCs as part of the curriculum. Universities produce distance education courses for use overseas. Again, I think we don't know how effective these developments really are. Those who believe in MOOCs and in distance education are true believers. They really think what they're doing is revolutionizing higher education. Maybe, we'll see. And finally, about internationalization, this whole issue of what my colleague Hans de Witt and others have called internationalization at home. How do you take best advantage, in the good sense of that term, of the international students that you have on your campus? And this university, of course, is a really good example. I don't know how effective, but it has a lot of international students, and I don't know how you use them to well inform your own domestic students. How can they be integrated? I do know that in the United States, including at my own university, we do not do a particularly good job at that. International students, especially on campuses not like ours, but others which have recruited large numbers of international students to make money from them, generally leave them off to the side. They're kind of ghettoized. They don't have a particularly good experience themselves. And the local domestic American students, and as you well know, Americans can be very insular, very not understanding of the rest of the world. We could benefit from insights from the international students already on our campuses, and we don't do a very good job of it. Some of us are trying, but not too successfully so far. The point is that internationalization at home is a key part of what an international initiative should be doing. So I hope in this relatively brief presentation, I've given you a sense of the revolution that's taken place, that still takes place, how the research universities fit in to that context, and what might be at least some of the requirements to do a good job in this context. It is, of course, for this institution to figure out what's the best way, really, of doing it in your own context. No one from the outside can do that. It needs to come from your own experience and from the particular, and I think really important, traditions of this institution. So thank you very much.